Hezbollah, Iran, the IRGC, they're not just over there. They are here. They are here in the United States. They are a threat to Americans, and we need to do everything we can to prevent them from conducting operations here.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Today I bring to you a special report as we expect announcement of an Iran deal coming out of the Vienna talks that have been taking place for over a year now. I have with me an expert on counterterrorism and sanctions. The one thing holding up the Iran deal announcement today is that the Iranians are demanding the lifting of the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation of the IRGC. Ambassador Nathan Sales will tell us more about that and what it means for the United States and the world community. Ambassador Sales served as the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights for the Trump administration, while also serving as the Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism and the Special Presidential Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Join me. Ambassador Nathan Sales, thank you so much for joining me on Global Perspectives.
Great to be here, Ellie. Thanks for having me.
I want to jump right into the Iran deal, which most of us are expecting an announcement out of the Vienna talks momentarily. You wrote a piece recently for Fox News, and in it, the headline is, Iran nuclear talks, Biden shouldn't turn a blind eye to terrorism to secure the deal. You highlight your role in the Trump administration to designate the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. And in this piece you write, an FTO designation is the gold standard, imposing costs that other sanctions cannot match. Could you tell us why you're calling it the gold standard?
Sure. And first of all, Ellie, thanks for having me on. It was a real honor to serve with you during the Trump administration at the State Department. And it's great to be back in touch, not in person, but virtually. And I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation and share it with your viewers. So, look, Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is the principal instrument that Tehran uses to sow terrorism around the world. And we're not just talking about terrorism in the Gulf or in the Middle East. We've seen the IRGC active right here in the United States, attempting to assassinate former American officials, attempting to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. by bombing a restaurant in Georgetown a number of years ago. So this is a clear and present danger to the United States, not just to our friends and allies in the Gulf region. So it seems to me that we need to be using every possible tool we can to impose costs on the IRGC. And the most effective terrorism sanction we have is the so-called FTO, or Foreign Terrorist Organization designation. Back in the Trump administration, we used this tool for the first time against the IRGC. It was the first time that the United States had ever sanctioned part of a foreign government. And remember, the IRGC is officially part of the Iranian armed forces. This was the first time we'd ever used the FTO sanctions against part of a foreign government. And the reason was obvious.
Ambassador Sales, so the reason why we're having this discussion is because the Iranians have made this their latest condition in the nuclear deal. They're demanding the United States lift this FTO designation off of the IRGC. And there were reports that Antony Blinken, our U.S. Secretary of State in Israel last week, in his conversations there, called the FTO designation symbolic in nature. What's your response to that?
Well, that's just not right. The FTO sanction is a lot more than mere symbolism. It imposes costs that other terrorism sanctions simply can't match, one of which is, under federal law, it is a criminal offense to provide so-called material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Material support is defined incredibly broadly. It means things like weapons, money, training, personnel. If you join an FTO, you've committed a crime. And the penalties for violating the FTO statutes are very strict. A single count can get you in jail for up to 20 years. The other terrorism sanctions we have don't have the same sort of criminal sanction backing them up. A second thing that the FTO statute does that other sanctions don't do is make it impossible for members of an FTO to enter the United States. The mere fact that a person is a member of an FTO is enough to render that person inadmissible to the United States. So if you take away the IRGC's status as a foreign terrorist organization, you make it harder to secure our borders against IRGC members and enablers who might be trying to come here to the United States. The third thing I would point to that's really special and unique about the FTO statute is it enables terrorism victims to seek justice in courts of law. What's unique about the FTO statute is that it broadens the aperture of defendants that people can go after to seek justice, not just the group itself, but also the group's supporters and enablers. If you delist the IRGC as an FTO, that ability for terrorism victims to seek justice goes away. So this is about a lot more than mere symbolism. This is about hardening our borders. This is about protecting the victims of terrorism. And this is about enabling prosecutors to go after some really bad guys.
Thank you for your clarification, because it seems like it would be a true disaster for the United States to even consider lifting this FTO designation. And yet the Biden administration, when they first came into office, did lift the foreign terrorist organization designation off of a different group, the Houthis, who are, terrorizing Saudi and Emirati civilian infrastructure and civilian sites endlessly since this designation was lifted. Could you share with our audience what the process was that our State Department went through in designating the Houthis in the first place, and what your thoughts are on this lifting of it?
Absolutely. So let me say a few words about who the Houthis are and why this matters. The first thing you need to know is that the Houthis are terrorists backed by Iran. They're a militia group that's fighting a civil war in Yemen. They receive enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of weapons from their patrons in Tehran. And they use these weapons, which include sophisticated drones and other precision munitions, to launch terror attacks against America's regional partners, including Saudi Arabia, including the UAE. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen a steady drumbeat of Houthi attacks on oil infrastructure in the region, on civilian airports and other civilian targets. If you are using Iranian missiles to attack civilian targets, by definition, you're a terrorist. And so during the Trump administration, we designated the Houthi group as a foreign terrorist organization because we were recognizing the obvious reality that this is a group that clearly meets the standards. This is a group that was not interested in the time in a negotiated settlement, a political solution to the conflict in Yemen. And so we thought not only does the FTO designation recognize the reality that this group is a group of terrorists, it also increases pressure on the group that can perhaps help get us closer to a political solution to this war in Yemen and to the regional instability that this war is causing. Unfortunately, one of the first things the Biden administration did when it came into office was lift that designation of the Houthis. I can tell you, since January of 2021, there has been no improvement whatsoever in the Houthis' behavior. They're still committing terrorist attacks against our allies in the region. We are no closer to a political solution or an end of the hostilities than we were 13, 14, 15 months ago.
Exactly right, and we are hearing a lot of feedback from our, historic U.S. allies, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the victims of these Houthi attacks, and they're looking for the U.S. to reverse this decision. I want to take us next to another terror group, Hezbollah. Under your leadership, Ambassador Sales, I would say this was one of our foreign policy successes in the Trump administration, was the fact that you succeeded in working with many of our European and Latin American allies to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And what I was wondering if you could shed light for our audience is the Hezbollah threat at the U.S. doorstep. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Absolutely. So when we think about Hezbollah, the first place our minds go is Lebanon. This is a terrorist organization that's based in Lebanon and that has committed acts of terrorism across Lebanon and in neighboring countries for many years. But Hezbollah's threat is not limited to Lebanon, and it's not limited to the Middle East. Hezbollah has stored weapons caches really across the globe, including in South America, including in Asia, including in Africa, including in Europe. In the heart of Western Europe, we've seen weapons caches by Hezbollah. And you have to ask, why is this Lebanese terrorist group storing these weapons across the world? And the reason is because they're stockpiling weapons, stockpiling explosives to be used whenever their masters in Tehran dictate that such is appropriate. Hezbollah blew up the Jewish community center in Buenos Aires a number of years ago. Hezbollah committed an attack on an Israeli tour group in Burgas, Bulgaria, not so long ago. This is what Hezbollah does. It is one of the deadliest proxies, one of the deadliest terror proxies that Tehran has. And Tehran uses this group to commit terrorism against American targets and against Israeli targets all around the world. So during the Trump administration, we thought it was important that because Hezbollah presents a global threat, we need to have a global response. The United States for years has designated Hezbollah as a terrorist group across the board. We don't accept this false distinction between the so-called political wing and the so-called military wing. It's one group, and it's a terrorist group. And by the way, do you know who else rejects the distinction between Hezbollah's political wing and military wing? Hezbollah itself. So I think we can take them at their word when they say that they are one organization with one mission, and that is the use of violence against American and Israeli and other targets to achieve their goals and the goals of their masters in Tehran. I was really excited to see so many countries around the world step up and join the United States in recognizing the reality that Hezbollah is a terrorist group across the board. I think we had 13 countries in Europe and in the Americas step up and say, yes, we're going to impose sanctions or we're going to ban the group across the board. We've done a lot of great work, but we still have more to do. In Europe, the EU still artificially distinguishes between the political wing and the military wing, with sanctions being limited to the so-called military wing. That's a good start, but it's not enough. We need to see more countries in Europe, and ideally the EU as a whole, recognize that the entire organization is a terrorist group and act accordingly.
Ambassador Sales, I just want to stay on Hezbollah for another moment. Could you tell us a bit about the Triborder area and the threat that it potentially poses, a Hezbollah presence there, for the United States?
So in the Triborder region of South America, where Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay come together, this is an area that has long been a hotbed of Hezbollah fundraising activity. You have illicit enterprises as well as licit enterprises that raise money and funnel it back into Hezbollah coffers in Lebanon. And so it's really important for countries in the region to have adequate legal capabilities to investigate things like money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and various other financial and financially related crimes, to use those capabilities against these Hezbollah procurement and fundraising networks. Now, when you're talking about Hezbollah, you have to be worried not just about the money men, but also about operatives. And we know that our southern border is not secure by any stretch of the imagination. And terrorist organizations are always looking for vulnerabilities. So anytime you have a terrorist organization that is active in the Western Hemisphere, we need to be mindful of the risk that our insecure southern border poses to the possibility of them coming across the border. Now, I don't want to be alarmist here. I don't want to overstate the concerns. There's no reason to think that Hezbollah operatives are actively exploiting vulnerabilities, but the mere fact that we have vulnerabilities in our border demands our attention, and it's something we need to focus on.
Exactly right. And also the fact that Iran is there at our doorstep through this Hezbollah proxy. I like to bring that to everyone's attention because, as you said in the beginning of our interview, there's sometimes a sense that Iran or the Hezbollah, these terror proxies, the IRGC, that they're far away. And I think sometimes we need to understand that they're closer than we may realize.
Ellie, that's exactly right. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think what you just said is the most important topic that we are covering today. Hezbollah, Iran, the IRGC, they're not just over there. They are here. They are here in the United States. They are a threat to Americans, and we need to do everything we can to prevent them from conducting operations here. This is not a threat that we can just think of as something that's in a far off place in the Middle East. This is a threat to Americans here at home.
Thank you for that clarification. And indeed, I do think it's a really important point for all of us to understand. I want to talk a bit also about ISIS. Certainly under the Trump administration, they were set back tremendously. Last week in Israel, there was a terror attack by two ISIS-affiliated Israeli Arabs, leaving 2 people dead and 6 injured. Could I ask your assessment on ISIS's capability today?
So ISIS as an organization is a shell of what it was at its height. At the height of the so-called caliphate, ISIS controlled territory in Iraq and in Syria, equal in size to, I think, Great Britain. Under the past 2 administrations, starting with the Obama administration and then intensifying during the Trump administration, the so-called physical caliphate was utterly destroyed. What the Trump administration did to accelerate the Obama administration's efforts was to delegate more operational authority away from Washington down to commanders in the field, on the theory that our commanders on the front lines are going to be in the best position to decide what sorts of operations are needed to really crush the ISIS so-called caliphate. And that was enormously successful. But even though the ISIS caliphate is gone, the ISIS brand still lives on. And we see copycat attacks or attacks inspired by ISIS ideology in a number of places around the world, including, sadly and tragically, in Israel not so long ago. I think it's important to understand the context against which this attack happened. This happens in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the Negev summit, an incredibly important diplomatic achievement in which a number of countries who have normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords met to signal a new era for the region. There are always going to be opponents of peace. There are always going to be terrorists who continue to want to marginalize and isolate Israel and who are trying to stand against the flow of history. And I think the attacks, the tragic attacks in Israel that we've seen in recent days are an attempt by terrorist organizations and their sympathizers to try and change the narrative. And the narrative is Israel is a normal country. It can have normal diplomatic relations with its neighbors, just like any other country. Trade is increasing, people-to-people contacts is increasing, travel between these countries and Israel is increasing. That is the direction that the Middle East is heading. It's a very exciting time, not just for Israel, but for its neighbors and for the United States as well, and all who want to see peace and prosperity in the Middle East. And these terrorists, whether inspired by ISIS or inspired by Hamas or inspired by Hezbollah, are rejectionist. Right? They are not just trying to kill individual Israelis. They're not just trying to murder individual Jews. What they're trying to do is change the direction of the region. And I got to tell you, they're not going to be successful at doing that.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Ambassador Sales, you are not only an expert on counterterrorism, and this conversation has been so enlightening, but you are also an expert on sanctions. And recently you penned an op-ed with Marshall Billingsley, who I've also had the honor of interviewing on this show, You wrote about the use of sanctions against Russia in this war that Russia has waged against Ukraine. Could you tell us what you think the United States and world community could be doing more of today? And also, I wanted to ask you if you think we could have done more before Russia invaded Ukraine.
So, what can we do now? More of everything. The United States has imposed a handful of sanctions on the Russian financial services sector, some sanctions on the central bank, some sanctions on oligarchs. We've decided to impose an embargo on U.S. imports of Russian energy. All that is good, but when you look at the atrocities, when you look at the war crimes that Putin is committing in Ukraine, when you read the propaganda that the Kremlin is putting out, basically calling expressly for genocide of the Ukrainian people, you understand that the measures that we have taken so far are entirely inadequate. The United States and our European allies have the power to crater the Russian economy. We can destroy Russia's economy in the same way that Russia is destroying Ukraine. And so far, we've been fighting with one hand tied behind our back. That needs to end. What we need to do is impose full sanctions on the entire Russian financial services sector, not just cherry picking a few banks here and there, all of them. We need to impose so-called blocking sanctions, which means banks that transact, American banks that transact with Russian banks, don't just report suspicious transactions to the Treasury Department. They actually have to freeze the funds, freeze the assets that are part of these transactions. And we need to impose secondary sanctions as well. What that means is third country nationals, our sanctions would be a warning to them. Don't try to evade our sanctions. Don't try to help Russia get around our sanctions, because if you do, we're going to impose costs on you as well. So that's the financial services sector. The other thing we need to do to cripple the Russian economy is go after oil and gas. Energy exports account for something like 63% of Russia's exports. We have the power to take that down to zero. We may not be able to do it overnight. It might take a week or a couple of weeks, a couple of months. The important thing is we need to announce now that that is what we are going to do, and markets will start reacting and start punishing Russia even in advance of these measures actually being put into place. The president has said, well, it's going to take a couple of months for us to see how the sanctions work, to see what's effective. Ukraine doesn't have a couple of months. There are corpses of hundreds of Ukrainians littering cities that Russians have retreated from. We can't afford to let the Russians continue to commit atrocities against peaceful Ukrainian citizens. The time to act is now, because Russia has escalated. We need to escalate in kind.
I know our time is running out, so I just want to shift our attention to China, because in your term in the State Department, you did lead our efforts to hold the Chinese accountable for their human rights abuses and for their policies towards Hong Kong and Hong Kong's freedom, limiting those freedoms. Just yesterday in the news, I saw something so chilling. It's hard for me to even get the words out. There's a report that came out of Australia that says that they believe the Chinese have been taking organs from live prisoners. Could you tell us what your belief is on the China's human rights records? And do you think that the world can stop China?
Well, China is one of the world's worst human rights offenders. Look at what they have done to Hong Kong. Hong Kong was this extraordinary beacon of liberty and democracy, or if not perfect democracy, something a lot closer to democracy than anything you see on the Chinese mainland. It was this beacon of liberty, and it's been crushed. It is now no more than your average Chinese mainland city with pervasive surveillance, with security services that brutally seek to stamp out any dissent, any vestiges of free speech. It's heartbreaking, in addition to being a geopolitical calamity. Look at what China is doing to the Uyghurs. It has incarcerated at least 1 million and probably many more than that. Chinese citizens who are Muslim, and incarcerated them and brainwashed them simply because of their desire to live out the tenets of their faith. China has declared a war on faith. So when you think about a party that is capable of committing atrocities like that, you really have to wonder whether the allegations about organ harvesting are so implausible. I'm not in a position to comment on the accuracy of that report. We've seen reports like this for many years coming out of China. The mere fact that they seem to be plausible tells you a lot about the state of human rights in China and about the need for the United States, along with our Western partners, to use our sanctions authorities and other tools like diplomacy, like multilateral diplomacy, to impose costs on China for the human rights atrocities that it routinely commits in the mainland, in Hong Kong. And make no mistake, they've got their eye on Taiwan. Taiwan could be next. Who knows whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, or some other timetable. But what we need to be doing is equipping the Taiwanese with every tool available to us to help them defend their precious democracy, defend their freedoms, and defend their homeland.
Well, Ambassador Sales, you have been one of the most strongest, most powerful, and most incredible proponents of freedom and of democracy all around the world. I can't thank you enough for your service to our country and for joining me today on Global Perspectives. Thank you so much.
Well, Ellie, it's been a real pleasure to speak with you again. Like I said at the start of our conversation, it was an honor to serve with you at the State Department. You did great work for the American people, combating the scourge of anti-Semitism around the world. And I'm really grateful to you for having me on today to have this conversation.
Thank you again, Ambassador.